Who's Lila is a weird game. It's unsettling right from the start, and it never relents. The gameplay revolves around contorting the protagonist Will's face to display an appropriate emotion, and almost every face is slightly uncanny in some way, and the audio is deeply unnerving. Though perhaps the weirdest element to the game is its story, which shifts dramatically throughout the course of the game and references religion, the occult, and conspiracy theories. However, my focus will be on the philosophy the game references, in hopes of finding answers to some of the game's most elusive questions. The game begins with William Clark, whose face does not move on its own, but rather only as the result of conscious decision making, which the player must control. Playing the game according to the in-game journal takes Will to school, where he is suspected in the disappearance of a girl named Tanya Kennedy. Will tries to cover up his crimes by murdering Martha Jennings, who saw them both together, but there is a seemingly psychosexual element in his targeting of women, expressed in the alter ego of Lila. Except that this Hitchcock-inspired interpretation doesn't last long. After the credits roll, regardless of what Will ends up doing, we are introduced to a meta-narrative battle between Lila and an FBI detective named Yu. Yu wants to know the true nature of Lila, a task that can only be accomplished by reaching all of the game's endings, each of which is associated with major arcana from tarot cards. It seems then that Lila has taken control of Will. Rather than being an alter ego, we see her internal monologue, not Will's, and Will's own consciousness appears to be trapped outside his body. Will's consciousness only has some small power left, seen in gameplay when his face contorts, regardless of the player's input, though some of these contortions may be Lila's influence. Now, knowing the intended fate of Will, the player may start exploring areas not set out in the journal. In particular, the ideas of the Fraternity of Lawrence, a cult Will was part of, that seems somewhat connected to Lila, the occult, and consciousness. Additionally, the player might hear of tulpamancy, a supposed method of creating new consciousness within one's mind. All these elements pull in different but similar directions. Is Lila a creation of Will's mind that has subsumed him? Is she the embodiment of the devil or temptation? Perhaps she is the result of the Lawrence fraternity and their tampering with the spiritual, or the vengeful spirit of Tanya. Regardless of which of these theories seems most compelling at the time, Lila finds each of them amusing when you confront her with them. It's clear that she's a being that exists in consciousness, even if her full nature and origins are unclear. But with this information, we can start to unravel some of the philosophical references in the game. The first reference I want to talk about requires thorough explanation to place it within history. It's the first reference you'll likely see when playing the game, referring generally to the hard problem of consciousness, and specifically to the work of David Chalmers and Thomas Nagel. To truly appreciate their work, I'm going to start with René Descartes, who posited that his theory of mind-body dualism, now known as Cartesian or substance dualism. It supposes that there are two distinct substances to a human: the material elements of the body, the limbs, the heart, the brain, etc., and the immaterial elements of the mind or soul. The mind or soul controls the body in some way, but has no physical extension of its own. This theory was fairly compatible with the dominant ideas of religion at the time, particularly from a linguistic point of view. The way Descartes conceived of himself as body and soul fits neatly into the ideas of a mortal body and an immortal soul. One issue for Cartesian dualism is the problem of interaction. That is, if the mind is entirely non-physical and has no physical extension or crossover into the physical, then how does my mind exert any influence on the body? Why is it that when I think to pick something up, my body immediately responds by doing so? Descartes never really gave this a satisfying answer. Almost any response requires some extra third substance like God to mediate between the two. With the development of greater scientific understanding, Cartesian dualism and to some extent the concept of the soul fell out of favour. Modern understanding of the body, and most importantly the brain, led many to believe in physicalism or materialism. The idea that consciousness or the mind as some separate substance doesn't really exist at all, and that we can have a complete understanding of the mind through material knowledge. In this view, pain, joy, surprise, anger are all simply neurons firing, or chemical or hormone production, or a description of behaviours. There's no more to understanding the mind than this, so consciousness as its own thing is merely a hallucination, as the brain and the mind are one and the same. This is a view that has bled into our language over time, as people become more comfortable referring to emotions through the lens of neuroscience. One might refer to themselves as feeling hormonal, or experiencing a rush of adrenaline, or maybe even a cortisol spike. These have not completely replaced our emotional language, but they are becoming part of it as common understanding conflates the mind and the brain. Now finally we get to our hard problems. These are problems that pose an issue for the materialist because they seem to show that understanding the mind or consciousness goes beyond understanding the physical components of the body. They are specifically hard problems because materialism does not have the tools to answer them. One formulation of this is Thomas Nagel's "What is it like to be a bat?", which posits that even with full physical knowledge of a bat, in regards to its brain, its use of echolocation, and its sensory capacities, we would still not understand what it is actually like to be one. The sensations themselves, the sense experience of being a bat, is beyond scientific and material understanding. Philosophers instead call these experiences qualia. The game seems to suggest then that a purely physical answer cannot suffice for explaining Lila, but at the same time it seems that Cartesian dualism isn't a great answer either, partially due to the aforementioned problem of interaction, which is especially incompatible with Lila, a being that is supposedly only consciousness, yet still extremely physically powerful. Another reason to try a different theory is due to one or two of the game's weirder endings. If the player chooses to aggravate Michael Graves, Tanya's ex-boyfriend who suspects Will has killed her, then Michael ends up pushing Will off of the roof of the school, and the player enters a dreamlike death sequence. One element of this sequence is a conversation between Will and Lila about the nature of identity and the self within the game's world. In this sequence, Lila argues that they only exist so long as they are perceived, and the entire content of their existence is imaginary, i.e. that they exist solely within the mind, and only when perceived by some grand perceiver or grand consciousness known as the Prince. Perhaps the most important piece of this puzzle arrives near the very end of the game. The ideas of the game leak outside of the confines of the application, requiring the player to go outside the game entirely, to a demon DLC, a Twitter page supposedly belonging to Tanya Kennedy, but also to a website made by a mad conspiracy theorist named Rybkin. This site not only confirms the existence of the Prince as granting the world its consciousness, but also suggests that society has been shaped by paradigmatic works of media, such as Lila and the in-game meme Dada Dog, which capture the minds of millions in order to serve some grander design. Rather than consciousness being some deeply personal attachment, or a vestigial element of the brain, like our previous theories suggest, in the world of Who's Lila, the mind and consciousness is the driving force behind everything. After finding all the game's endings, the player can go back to the meta-narrative between Detective Yu and Lila, in which she reveals herself to be in control of Will's body, and that the entire game exists just to keep our attention, and to keep Lila alive within our mind as the player. This explains all the myriad ideas of philosophy, religion, and the occult being thrown in as potential explanations. As long as the player keeps questioning Lila, she remains alive and well within the player's mind, supposedly feeding off of their curiosity. With these ideas established, we can now finally move on to my theory as to the nature of consciousness within Who's Lila. I think that this game mirrors the ideas of one Bishop Berkeley. Berkeley posited that only the mind exists, and it is matter that is an illusory concept, because the only way we interact with the world is through sense data, and we can never learn anything without the use of our mind and senses. Defining matter without using these terms is almost impossible. Berkeley claims that to be is to be perceived. In a world consisting only of qualia, thinking or conscious beings determine reality, though Berkeley adds to this claim by claiming that because God perceives all, reality remains consistent. Applying this theory to Who's Lila does many things. For one, it explains Lila's existence and how she is able to interact with the world surrounding her. Lila's end goal of keeping us guessing makes sense in a world that ceases to exist when we stop contemplating it. As the prince, we keep the story alive. The concept of Lila remains solidly in our minds, fortified by endless questioning. Lila is a consciousness not quite as powerful as the prince, but she still is able to manipulate lesser minds, such as will, in order to do her bidding. The powerful works of media that Rybkin proposes are an extension of this philosophy. An idea that is deeply embedded in one's consciousness is a means of control when seeing is believing. Even the title Who's Lila is an act of perception, a vile trick by Lila to stave off her own mortality. Hey, thanks for watching. Sorry if this video was hard to understand or overly wordy. I really wanted to make a video on Who's Lila and some of the philosophy I was studying at the time I first played it. The next few videos will probably be a return to more conventional game design analysis, and if you have a game you'd really like me to cover, please don't hesitate to leave a comment below.